thanks everyone for joining our member selection criteria workshop today. It's great to see everyone and be with each other in this virtual space for this workshop together for the Washington Climate Assembly. Again, thank you so much for participating. So some context, this workshop is an important step in designing a successful Washington Climate Assembly, and we're grateful for everyone's participation. So before I wanted to get started, I do want to notify and announce it to everyone that we will be recording today's workshop session, both to help us with note-taking and to capture each step in the assembly design process. We can see the recording has already started as well. I would also like to start off our meeting today with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge that the people of Washington State live and work on traditional lands of the indigenous people who have been here since time immemorial. There are 29 federally recognized tribes and 7 non-federally recognized tribes within the boundaries of Washington State. Tribes and tribal peoples have bring thousands of years of traditional knowledge to our present moment. Tribes bring an important and vital voice to the current conversation, and we honor all of our tribal relations. So my name's Mike Chang, and so I'm serving as the Deputy Project Manager for the coordinating team. I'm an associate here at Cascadia Consulting Group. I'm joined today by other members of our coordinating team, Gretchen Mueller from Cascadia, Emily Wright, and Carla Brolier from For the People. All of us will serve as facilitators in some capacity today. We also have Wendy from Cascadia helping with note-taking and managing some of our logistics and tech support as well. So we also want to get to know everyone here and hopefully have participants get to know each other. We would like everyone to please type their name, their affiliation into the chat. And we also have this icebreaker question. I think it's always nice to get to know each other in another sense, apart from our name and affiliation, and pronouns too, if you're able. But we want to see, where do you most want to go on vacation right now? I know currently we're doing this over Zoom because like many of us, we've probably been on Zoom for a lot of hours over the past few months. And I know many different plans have been disrupted. So yeah, we want to hear, where do you most want to go on vacation right now? So we have Sue from Swim, Sunny, Monica wants to go to Greece. Sunny wants to vacation to England to see grandchildren. David, Interfaith Earth Care Coalition, wanting to go to Victoria. Leah wants to go anywhere warm. Definitely empathize with that. This is the week that I began to turn on my heater at home as well. Ed wants to go to Georgia. Laura going to Texas to visit family. Brianna wanting to go to Uruguay. It's spring there right now. Oliver going to Southern Utah next week. Sue, Scottish Highlands. Sherry, Colorado to see their kids. Wendy, Taiwan. That's great. My family's from Taiwan, Wendy. So I have a lot of connections there. Julianne, visiting the ancestral village in Yongfen, China. Great. And I see we have a few other people joining us, and so we're just doing introductions. So please type your name into the chat, your affiliation, preferred pronouns, an icebreaker question of where do you most want to go on vacation right now? Great. Next slide, please, Wendy. So I know, again, a lot of us have spent many hours, more than we care to count, on Zoom over the last few months. But I do want to go over and spend a moment just walking through some of the best practices to kind of help for a smooth call and transition. So first is making sure that when you log in, that your username reflects your name. So you can go, if you right click, you can rename yourself. Using your computer to connect to Zoom, that kind of helps a lot of the different functionalities with chat and clicking and following through some of the links we'll be sharing today. We do have a decently sized group, so kind of using the hand raising function to request to speak to the group or to indicate a vote. And so if you access the hand raising function, if you click on participants, the raise hand button is at the bottom of the participants list. We'll also be monitoring the chat box for any questions or comments that come up today. So if you can't find that, feel free to use the chat box liberally. Um, we don't all have headsets. I have a headset, but that oftentimes can cancel some of the ambient noise. And I guess the most important thing is when we're not talking, keeping ourselves muted so we don't get some of that background noise as well. Next slide, please. So we're excited that you're all joining us today. So we're meeting from 1 to 3 p.m. This afternoon. And so the purpose of the member selection criteria workshop is to refine the parameters for selecting Washington Climate Assembly members. So how we'll get there over the next 2 hours, we'll be asking for your input on both the eligibility criteria, or in other words, who can participate, in the demographic criteria, or the cross-section of Washington residents, as well as the associated target numbers for the recruitment process. We'll also be looking for your red flag review of the eligibility and ineligibility criteria, but we'll focus most of our time and conversation today on the demographic criteria discussion. We'll then bring the outcomes of this workshop to Strategic Research Associates, a Spokane-based research firm that specializes in qualitative and quantitative research, who we've hired to conduct the initial Assembly Member Recruitment, which is recruiting 120 Washingtonians among the group in which selections will be made for the 80 Assembly members and the 10 alternates. So before we jump in, I do want to give kind of an overview. So what are the goals for this workshop, and what is the history and timeline of the workshop and the Washington Climate Assembly? So the goals for today is to refine the parameters for selecting Washington Climate Assembly members and to help guide member recruitment and help shape the composition of the Assembly. The scope of this is we want to solicit your input on both the eligibility criteria and the demographic criteria. Outcomes from this workshop will be shared with Strategic Research Associates, like we said before, who's helping us with the Assembly member recruitment process. We also wanted to spend a few moments walking through the history of the Washington Climate Assembly and what climate assemblies are, how they've been used, and why they're important to gain a shared understanding amongst all of you before we dive deeper into this workshop. So we have an initiating team. So the initiating team was the convener for this Washington Climate Assembly, and it was convened by the People's Voices on Climate, a nonprofit working towards climate solutions. In early October, the initiating team hired the coordinating team. And so the coordinating team consists of Cascadia Consulting Group and For the People. And we were hired in early October to be third-party facilitators to lead an inclusive and neutral assembly process. So what is a climate assembly? A climate assembly is a group of people gathered together in one place for a common purpose. A people's or citizens' assembly is a democratic process that seeks to answer a question or solve a problem facing a community in a way that fairly represents the interests of people from all walks of life. An assembly can center around any topic, and in the case of Washington Climate Assembly, our assembly centers around the problem of climate pollution. Assemblies have been used worldwide to shape the work of governments. At the Washington Climate Assembly, members will learn about the issues of climate pollution, take time to discuss with one another, and then make recommendations about what should happen legislatively. They bring together everyday people to learn about climate change, hear from a variety of experts, stakeholders, and tribal perspectives. Collectively, Assembly members will consider potential actions and discuss what should happen. At the end, the Assembly offers recommendations to elected officials and the wider public, which can be turned into laws. So we want to walk through a more detailed project timeline. So the timeline is divided into two phases: the assembly design phase, which you can see in teal, and the assembly implementation phase, which is in purple. And as you can see in the timeline, we are in the design phase of the project. So there's a lot to do in this month of November. We've conducted outreach for both the scoping workshop, which happened on Tuesday, and the member selection criteria workshop, which is today. The initiating team is also recruiting members for the monitoring team, which approves the rulebook. And then we're also recruiting for other roles, including agenda consultants, presenters, and people to help promote the Washington Climate Assembly as well. And so we also wanted to give, kind of nested in this broader timeline, we wanted to give kind of a specific, more detailed timeline about the member recruitment process. So between November 16th through early December 7th, Strategic Research Associates will begin its initial recruitment. We also have a sortition process as outlined in the rulebook. So we anticipate that happening after this initial recruitment has been finalized. In mid-December, we aim to have the assembly members announced. And then between mid to late December through early January, we'll be onboarding assembly members, making sure they have the right equipment, technology, access. And then starting in January 12th, we're anticipating to start the Washington Climate Assembly. So I'm going to turn it over to one of my colleagues, Carla, to go a little bit deeper about eligibility criteria.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody, and welcome to anybody that just got joining us. And I'm going to review a little bit more of the eligibility criteria, talking about some of the things that will refine the process, and then go into some examples of some of other areas that have tried a climate assembly. And then we can go into discussion and discuss anything around these parameters as well. So with that, we're going to be doing a little bit of work on looking at some of the background that's going to be defining the eligibility criteria. And this information is going to be used from other examples of other assemblies that have been existing in places like the UK and Oregon. So the eligibility criteria and our definition of who can participate at a base level, the goal here is essentially to make it as inclusive of a process as possible to aim to remove any participant barriers if possible. And so for the two examples that we have for the Citizens Assembly and how we define them is the first one that was in the UK for the Climate Assembly is the people that were eligible to partake was the permanent UK residents that were 16 and over. They lived in a household that received an invitation. They could RSVP to take part of the assembly. And they were permanent UK residents. So that means anyone that stays or intended to stay in the UK for a period of 12 months or more at the date of the invitation letter. And with that, on the flip side, the people that could not apply were members of either the House of UK Parliament, any national assemblies for Wales, the Scottish Parliament, Northern Ireland Assembly, and the staff of those members. And other people that weren't able to apply were local authority council members, elected mayors, or paid political party of UK Parliament. So this is just to give an example of some of the ways that we might be able to create some of the parameters when we're developing the same process as well. And as far as the Oregon Assembly, theirs was focused more on the COVID recovery rather than a climate assembly. So theirs was more based on voting. So it was anybody that was 18 or older and an Oregon resident, but that was more based about who was an Oregon resident in that one. So we're going to review a draft eligibility and ineligibility criteria for the Washington state. And the parameters of that right now are going to be looking more of the eligibility criteria of the Washington state residents being 16 years or older, living in a household that received a phone call from the recruitment firm and could RSVP to take part of the assembly. And so far, some of the ineligibility criteria is a person holding a managerial position in the governor's office or organizational units of Washington and public companies of Washington, elected politicians, employees of the stakeholders whose tasks are directly related to the subject of the assembly, and members of the stakeholder groups and members of their organs. Also, lobbyists related to the subjects of the assembly. And the final two are members of the coordinating team and monitoring team, and expert observers and facilitators. And so with this, we're going to dive a little bit more into some of the criteria around what it's going to look like and who's going to be able to be a part of this in a discussion format. So with that, we could discuss if our parameters are missing anything and if we would like to review them again or discuss any of the details in it. We can open up a little bit more to conversation at this point. If there are any specific questions, happy to either put them into chat or you could raise your hand and we can answer them that way. If you'd like a little bit more clarity on any of them, happy to give that as well. So here's our draft eligibility and ineligibility for the criteria for the Washington State Assembly. So they're pretty open. So the idea is that we want it to be as inclusive as possible. Anybody that is in this, we are opening it for people under 18 at this point. We are very aware that climate is going to be impacting youth coming in the future. So that was one of the criterias. And clearly need to be a Washington State resident and somebody that the recruitment firm contacted and somebody that could participate in the entire process was so far the eligibility threshold. And also the ineligibility are anybody that might have any kind of stakes or claims in this, such as like lobbyists or staff members or anybody else that might be a part of this. So with that, I would be delighted to talk through some of the questions that we might have coming up.
Carla, there was a couple questions in the chat. One from Sue, noting that you don't see seniors or students younger than 16 with a special interest in climate, noting they have much less baggage. And Brianna asking about including the unhoused or housing insecure folks, noting their particular vulnerability to climate change, and then clarifying what stakeholders mean.
Yeah, that is great. So with seniors in particular, we have the demographic of 16 and older. So as long as the senior is 16 and older, then they are able to be a participant in this. And under 16, that is something that we're able to discuss. This is right now the preliminary eligibility criteria. So if there is any part that anybody wants to discuss for under 16, there are going to be some additional parameters around it, having somebody that's going to be young a part of this. So this is something that we could always discuss a little bit more and talk through some of the details in our breakout session. But again, these are just our initial parameters. These are not the ones set in stone as of right now. So if we'd like to create some kind of a discussion on if these feel right to you, or if we want to kind of adapt these in different ways and how that would look. So with that, I guess to answer the next question, stakeholder, that would be under ineligibility criteria. So that would be somebody that has any type of like a staffer or anybody that might be directly related to it. Or like, for example, myself or Emily, we have some kind of vested interest in this. So we wouldn't be eligible to be on the assembly as well. So anybody that has any kind of vested interest in this might not be able to be participating in this. If there's other questions. Yes, Julianne. So the households that received a phone call, yes, this was part of the recruitment process that we went through. And it is limiting in that process, yeah. So not everybody does have a phone, and we're aware of this. But if there are any more conversation parts around this that we want to discuss that would have any more accessibility measures, we are happy to discuss that as well.
And Carla, I can quickly weigh in on that too. So Strategic Research Associates, they do recruitment all the time and use the phone method and feel like it's actually the most accessible way to reach folks. And it is not just limited to landlines. So I don't have the statistic off the top of my head, but 90-something% of Washington residents have a phone. So it's been a successful methodology that they've used in the past. That includes cell phones and landlines.
Okay, I see that Sherry has raised her hand. Would you like to ask your question, Sherry?
Yeah, Emily responded a bit about the residency question, and I just wanted to bring up maybe how long is that even is it an issue? Like, if I just recently moved to Washington, is there any sort of a criteria around that? I noticed you had that as an example of in the UK, right? They were you wanted people that were like invested in the outcome of this. And so I guess I'm just wondering about that as, does it matter? But I guess I wanted to open it up for discussion.
Yeah, that's a fantastic discussion point. If anybody else would like to weigh in on how we would measure that, it's being a state, it's a little bit different than the UK. So it's a state-based initiative. So it's a little different on that level of obtaining a country access. So I think it might be just kind of open for discussion on that. You know, if you wanted to say if like you've lived here a year, or if you live here now, or however you want to include that.
Can I ask another question? This is Stephanie. Is there a way to look at like, I don't know if you included regions in your metrics here. So are you trying to recruit equal numbers of people from different parts of the state, or just make sure that you're representing people that, you know, are stakeholders in different types of economies? So for instance, you know, the urban coastal economies are quite different than, you know, the more rural economies along the coast, the tribal economies, or then are in some cases they're radically different from the economies in the Columbia River Basin. So a lot more farmers, orchardists, ranchers, tribal folks, people I think who are a harder audience to reach but could receive the greatest benefits from a green economy. I wonder how to balance that representation and also bring different perspectives and help unify the state on this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a fantastic question and perspective. I think maybe we could take this and hold it while we bring it into the breakout groups as well. The intention is that if we have different representations of different sectors, as well as age groups and different geographical areas and different walks of life as a whole, then we're going to be able to get a lot more input from all of the different areas and see where people are affected differently by climate change and by climate pollution and the impacts that it might have either on health or economics or access to social mobility or different dynamics of their life in that way. And so breaking it apart into different demographic regions will absolutely help with that. So if we have, for example, everybody in the Seattle area, it won't necessarily be representative of Washington as a whole. So getting different demographics of that area and how we want to break that apart and designating it to each areas is going to be something that we definitely want to be very conscious and cognizant of moving forward. So that is a fantastic perspective, and making sure that we also do hold at the same time the tribal sovereignty members that are going to be a part of this as well. So yeah, thank you so much for that. And it looks like for the next question, Ed also has his hand raised.
Yeah, so I've got a number of observations and questions. One is that I think we should distinguish the eligibility criteria from the recruitment process. I think a lot of people's questions really have to do with whether everybody truly is going to be recruited. So for example, there's a question about documentation, undocumented people. Well, if you look at the eligibility criteria, it's clear that everybody is eligible, whether you're documented or not. It's clear that whether you have a phone or not, you're eligible. It's clear that whether you're housed or not, you're eligible. A real question becomes, how is the recruitment going to happen? And do the eligible people truly have an equal chance of being recruited? So that's not on the agenda. I would love to hear it addressed, and I would love to see the direction given very definitely to your contractor who's going to be doing this part of the outreach, that you want, to the extent possible, that this entire population of the eligible people to truly be within the reach of the outreach. So that's one observation. I have some similar questions to some other folks. One is in the very first ineligible criterion, it says public companies of Washington. So managerial positions in public. So I assume that means that if you're in any managerial position in any public company that you're not eligible. I guess I wonder about that, because I imagine there are a lot of people in some kind of lower or mid-management positions in public companies. I wonder if we're unnecessarily removing some people from the population, and whether there might be a more sophisticated way to remove the people that we truly think have too much of a vested interest. There was a question about stakeholders and what that means, and that is, I think, way too vague, unless there's a really great definition of it to include here. So I'm going to suggest instead that instead of the third and the fourth bullets saying stakeholder, that instead it say members of groups involved in advising on, presenting to, or overseeing the assembly, right? Because those are the people that you don't want to have an undue influence in those aspects. So that's a recommendation. I think that's all of my comments right now.
Yeah, those are fantastic comments and very, very appreciated on that. Yeah, I guess we could delve a little bit more into the stakeholder terminology and see if we want to change that language to be more reflective of what it is that we're trying to intentionally exclude. So as my example with like Emily and myself, so that we aren't a part of this, and how to make sure that people are not going to be influenced by any of the aspects of knowing how this background operation works, or that if we might have any kind of biases towards this or anything of that nature. So happy to talk through any of the language on that might be resonant to anybody moving forward. We can do this. We will have a little bit more sessions for after this, a little more of a individual breakout sessions, so we can talk through some of the details and workshop some of the language in here if we want to do that as well. And to the point of the eligibility versus access, we can discuss that a little bit more in detail as well, since that is an aspect that we have thought a lot about. And I know Gretchen could speak a little bit more towards this as well, as far as the work that we've done to set up the consulting firm to do outreach on this. There is a lot of parameters and a lot of thought put into making sure that the accessibility for all people was included in this, regardless of if they have a telephone or if they need computers or all of those different dynamics like that. And so there is a lot of thought that was put into it, but at the same time, we need to be able to make sure that they can participate in the assembly. Being that we still are in COVID, it puts us in a lot of limitations right now around access to technology. And this is clearly an inequality issue, but it might be a bigger conversation that we can have a little bit more deeply if we wanted to look at some of the parameters that brought us to this point as well.
Yeah, thanks, Carla. Yeah, and that is something that comes later. So when the recruitment firm, when they have their initial touch point with potentially interested folks or folks that they're randomly reaching out to, the one of their questions kind of in that conversation, a little bit further down in their conversation, is related to access needs or language needs, those types of things. And so they mark that, and that's tracked. And then if they continue to, stay part of this process and then eventually get selected in that sortition, the sortition phase, once we've got our 120 plus folks from Strategic Research Associates, goes into sortition where there's a lottery-based system and kind of randomly generates out our 80 member plus 10 alternates. And then we would work very closely with each of those folks to make sure that all of their access needs were met. And there is funding to support things like laptop access, internet, those types of things. We also, on our team, from the coordinating team side, have our IT person, Brent Edgar, who's also a part of this call today too, who will be supporting and helping folks get set up to remove that technology barrier. Childcare stipends, those types of things are all part of this as well.
Thank you, Gretchen. So before we move on to the next section, I just wanted to check and see if anybody else wanted to have any comments, just as like an initial gut check of seeing if this seems like a good initial start for the eligibility and the ineligibility. And then also on that, see if anybody noticed anything that we were missing or didn't include in this. Feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to chat. And then after these questions, we can move on to the next session. So it looks like we have Julianne.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the thought that everyone's putting into this. I also had a question about the stakeholders piece, because depending on how it's defined, let's say that you have a climate justice organization, or you have a big green like 350 or whatever, like if those people are considered stakeholders, then anybody who's ever donated to 350 or anybody who has, who organizes their volunteer life around climate change would be excluded. And I feel like you would miss out on some really great thinking by doing that. And also, what about people who work for fossil fuel industries or the military, or stakeholders in like the other direction? Like you wouldn't want to limit participation in one direction, but not another.
Yeah, that is a fantastic perspective. And I think we could talk a little bit more about that and what it means into the breakout session. But on the same token, we do want to make sure that we're inclusive of everybody that is impacted. And everybody that is impacted is a resident of the Washington state. So we can talk a little bit more through that to see if we do want people from either polar sides to be a part of this, or if we want to discuss it a little bit more and see the benefits and the pros and the cons of including those types of climate change spectrum folks. And so it looks like we have Laura also that has raised her hand.
Can get this to, there we go. Sorry, my Zoom's been a little a little difficult recently. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I definitely agree with the comments around making the eligibility and ineligibility criteria very specific, because I think, you know, if you have been working as part of this process, you might know what a stakeholder group is or the coordinating team and monitoring team. I think just having it be very clear for the everyday person who might be part of this assembly to understand that, you know, obviously there are you could say elected politicians, you know, what about people who hold political office in non-elected positions? Should they be included? Should they not be? And similarly, I think the questions around stakeholder groups, you know, I think that part of what's been raised is that people do have a vested interest in climate change already. I think, you know, the vast majority of Americans care and think something should be done about it. And so I would be, yeah, surprised if people don't have strong views about what should happen coming into the assembly in the first place. And so I definitely want to be very specific about the reasons why we would want individuals to be ineligible. I think the general gut check of the ineligibility criteria and eligibility criteria are good, but I think overall having really clear rationale for why specific government officials, specific members of stakeholder groups, and even lobbyists, I think, or others excluded, I think will be important for basically building trust in the assembly process, because there are a lot of people who work for the government and are everyday normal people. So just thinking through how to be as specific as possible and have those rationale clear.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That is very good point. And it is very nuanced. And I think we could talk a little bit more about that if we want to adjust or adapt the stakeholder by putting more specific lists behind that. That might add a little bit of clarity around this question. So we talk about some of the people like Cascodia Consulting or other stakeholders that might not be eligible to participate in this, might be one of the sub lists, but we could detail it out and see if there might be another better word that we could use that would be more inclusive of what we're trying to actually obtain with this concept. So yeah, thank you. And it is nuanced. And I'm sure we can, in our breakout rooms, come up with something that might be a little bit more specific to what we're trying to obtain with this concept here. Unless there's any other comments, happy to move on to the next session.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carla. And the next agenda item is related to demographic criteria. And recognizing there was already some conversation around demographic criteria, and now we're actually planning to dive in more deeply with you all, both as a full group discussion and also in breakouts as well. So how we framed this agenda item, first, a very similar format to what we just walked through with the eligibility and ineligibility criteria. So first, we'll provide a background on how we're defining demographic criteria, then share information on how this criteria will be used within the Washington Climate Assembly model, provide examples from other assemblies. So we have an example of, again, using both the UK Climate Assembly and then also the Oregon COVID Recovery Citizen Assembly that they just completed back in September of this year. So we'll be sharing how they define demographic criteria in each of those efforts. And then we'll share with you all a draft of what we have right now for the Washington Climate Assembly for, as I mentioned, both full group discussion as well as breakouts as well. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So here, the simple definition of how we're defining demographic criteria. Basically, what it breaks down to in its simplest form is the composition of assembly members. And recognizing, to Ed's point earlier, there are kind of two phases. There's first the recruitment phase of those 120 individuals that will be recruited, kind of randomly recruited, but to fit a set of demographic criteria and target numbers that we'll share with you in just a moment. Those 120 folks then go through the sortition lottery process where we end up with our 80 plus 10 alternates that our hope, and if done correctly, would closely align with the Washington state population. Some really key considerations to the composition of Assembly members. We wanted to bring these forward to you all, and we'll be discussing in just a moment. So how closely does the 80 Assembly members plus 10 alternates match the Washington state population? And how do we ensure an equitable and inclusive process throughout the Assembly? Because any process, and Strategic Research Associates is very clear with us as well, that there, even in the recruitment process, there are folks that will drop out. So they show initial interest in wanting to participate, but then they don't end up, kind of following through with the steps that the recruitment firm has for them before they're kind of part of that 120 folks that go through the sortition process. But then also, so that's kind of part of the design phase, but then in the implementation phase, so when we actually convene the assembly and they meet for those 34 hours of assembly hours, that there could be an assembly member that gets sick, an assembly member that misses a meeting, or an assembly member that drops out of the assembly process. So they start in January, but they don't complete those 34 hours with us. So how do we kind of put a system in place in this initial recruitment phase that ensures that those 120 folks that are initially recruited that then become our 80 assembly members plus 10, but that we're kind of covering our bases in terms of making sure that we maintain a certain composition of assembly members from start to finish of the process. So we can go to the next slide, please. So how did the UK use demographic criteria? This is how, and we pulled this from their website. So they selected 105 assembly members to match the UK population as closely as possible. A total of 110 members were selected to account for any potential dropouts. They use the remaining 5 seats to oversample groups that are either very small or would potentially be more likely to drop out of the assembly process. And in our conversations with Strategic Research Associates, there are, they have a very good kind of pulse read based on past work that they've done that suggests that there are certain folks that tend to stay through a process to the end, and others that have a higher dropout rate from kind of start of a process to a finish. And so really wanting to account for some of those trends, both in the recruitment phase with our demographic criteria, target numbers, and then also making sure that it, again, kind of follows us all the way through the full assembly process. And also the UK example where assembly members had to withdraw between recruitment and the first weekend of the assembly. They replaced them from a pool of potential assembly members and tried to find as exact a match for the person withdrawing as possible against all of the selection criteria. So this is how the UK Climate Assembly described their demographic criteria on their website, and kind of the methodology that they use and the rationale around that methodology for both the recruitment and then in the actual implementation phase as well. And we can go ahead. Yeah, thanks, Wendy. The other example that we pulled from, similar to what Carla spoke to, was the Oregon example. And as I mentioned, they just completed a citizen assembly back in September, where they pulled together, it was a smaller group of people that they pulled together, but around COVID recovery and what that would look like, and how they defined demographic criteria here. They selected a minimum of 2 panelists in any given subcategory and artificially increased targets so that nobody stood alone in their demographic criteria or demographic category. And this will make sense when we show you in just a moment kind of what their demographic profile looked like. And in just a second, Wendy will pivot and share the page 4 of the meeting packet that we shared with you. And that's also attached to the meeting invite as well. They were purposeful in over-representing to help prevent tokenization and isolation. And when a population in any demographic or political category that was relatively homogenous, there's, they're kind of part of their rationale for their methodology. They stated that there's arguably an increased value to everyone to have an additional voice from a small minority subcategory. Also something that they really wanted to note, that they recognized the unintended effect of allowing for intentional manipulation. So again, kind of rationale for, and kind of that trade-offs piece in their methodology and their ultimate, the target numbers for their demographic profile. And as part of this and part of kind of balancing out that unintended effect, facilitators in their process sought to prevent this by both acknowledging it as a risk and also using a standard set of subcategories for all of their projects. And so with that, I would love to hop over here, and if we can make this just a little bit bigger on your end, Wendy. This is also in your meeting packet for reference to. There are a few pages from page 4 to 7 in your meeting packet. This just shows kind of a visual of what I've been talking about in terms of demographic criteria. In a moment, we're going to first share with you our categories. So you see on the far left of this document, the demographic profile from the Oregon example. They've got their categories and breakdowns by category. So how did they define age range? How did they define geographic region, party registration, whether they voted or not in the last presidential election? How did they define gender? How did they define race, ethnicity, and so forth? And then kind of moving over to, as you look at this document over to the right, it shows how many, and if we can just go ahead and move to the way top here, Wendy. Yeah, it shows a column of the percent of the Oregon population, 18 and over. Then based off of that, the target number of panelists that they, that they kind of, their mathematical equation for figuring that out. They also shared if the person or people were selected by mail versus phone, and then how many people actually were on the panel. And so we thought this was a great example of how it could be done. And so just kind of as a recap there, just wanting to share this with you in the meeting packet and as a reference point as we then move into our draft demographic criteria as we have it right now for the Washington Climate Assembly. And we'll share that with you. We'll open it up for full group discussion to see if you all think anything's missing, if this seems right. I do want to note kind of these categories on the far left are pretty standard. But we definitely want to run through what we have so far with you all for the Washington Climate Assembly as a full group before we get into breakouts and actually talk about target numbers and key considerations around equity and inclusion and other things like that. Any questions on either of those two examples before I share with you all the kind of where we are with the draft demographic criteria for the Washington Climate Assembly? Looks like we've got something from Leah in the chat. How did the intended recruitment match with the actual recruitment in Oregon? Yeah, so if, and we'll go ahead, we can go back to the previous page. So to answer your question, intended recruitment to actual recruitment, that's a really, really good question. I don't know, Emily or others on my team, if you came across that. I didn't come across that in terms of the Oregon example. Emily?
I believe how I'm reading it is that in the graph or the chart on page 4 of the meeting packet, my understanding is the column that says target number of panelists was kind of the intended or desired recruitment numbers, and then the selected panel is like what they actually ended up with. That's how I'm reading it, but yeah,
I think you're right. Yep, I think that's right. Does that address your question, Leah?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Any other questions on either the definition of the demographic criteria that I shared with you or the examples from either Oregon or the UK before we move into ours? then we can go ahead and go back to the slide deck, Wendy. And they have a lot of information that I actually included in your meeting packet for reference from the Oregon example. So they both shared their, that demographic profile, and then all of the methodology that went behind kind of their decision points. Laura, you've got your hand up?
No, go ahead. I was just, why don't you present the demographic criteria and then I'll ask my question afterwards.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is what we have right now as, and kind of before we dive into the assembly member composition, so those kind of target numbers and desired representation by the various different categories, we wanted to share the draft demographic criteria that Strategic Research Associates, our research firm, is using for recruitment right now, and get your thoughts and kind of gut check and if we're missing anything here. And just a reminder too, these are pretty standard criteria, but we did want to take a few moments and get some anything you want to share, reactions related to this list. Laura.
Thank you so much, Gretchen. So it's interesting. I having seen a lot of different demographic criteria in similar, not assemblies necessarily, but deliberative processes in the US in comparison to the ones in Europe. What I've found is that the political party preference and voting history is something that's definitely much more of an American standard demographic criteria than some of the other experiences that I've seen happening. You mentioned the UK one. There's also the Scotland Citizens Assembly on Climate that's happening right now. And I actually, this is a personal thought, or rather a suggestion, is that given the fact that climate change is such a politically difficult topic that often is polarized along party lines, I actually would suggest that rather than using political party preference and voting history, that using polling data on attitudes to climate change would be a more holistic representation of attitudes in Washington towards climate, because specifically the fact that if you end up with demographic representation by political party, that doesn't necessarily represent people's views on climate change. And so it's hard because we tend to think of climate as a particularly, as an issue that Democrats care about more than Republicans. And I worry a little bit that using political party preference and voting history, that it would miss people who do care about climate change, or maybe don't care about climate change in different ways, rather than using just that straight across data, for example, from the Yale climate communications folks who do that, 6 Americas, are you very concerned about climate change? Do you think it's real, et cetera. I think that especially as we work towards understanding the nuances of political party preference and how right now, in a lot of ways, people within political parties have vastly different policy views, it might be more helpful and more demographically representative to go straight to the source of what do you think about this issue already.
Excellent. Thanks so much for sharing, Laura. That's all great. And I did see in the chat a couple of questions related to age. So age is one of our demographic criteria. It's missing from the slide. So thank you for catching that. Julianne?
I had a question / comment too.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Julianne, and then I'm not sure who that was.
Cha-Cha.
Okay, Cha-Cha. Julianne, and then Cha-Cha.
One of the things in the packet said by like the 10 congressional districts or something, and those seem like really big areas to represent a single viewpoint, speaking as someone in Mason County, Washington. And I'm wondering about, what about doing it by RIA, watershed resource, what is it, inventory area or something, so that it's like the geographic location is based on a watershed. And also, I don't really know how, I don't have a suggestion yet for how to solve this issue, but I sort of feel like just breaking up by race and ethnicity and geography doesn't really account for the importance of having tribal members as part of the assembly. And you know, if you think about there being, you know, this many recognized tribes and this many unrecognized tribes, and I think there's some, that the difference between like different tribes is really is big. And so to not just have it collapse down to X% by race seems kind of important for getting a bigger view of, like a long-term bigger view of what's going on in Washington and what needs to be done. And I think that there is some history for quote unquote overrepresenting tribes legislatively or like legally in terms of, say, like the 74 Bolt decision and co-management of things as well.
Great points, Julianne. Thank you so much. Yes, and we have flagged the importance of having tribal members both as, or tribal representatives, both potentially as assembly members, but also as folks that come in and share perspectives as part of our agendas. And so the Strategic Research Associates is aware of that as an important piece of this, and we flagged that for them. So great point. Thank you so much, Julianne. Excellent. And then Cha-Cha, you had a comment that you wanted to share, a question?
Yeah, I was going back to Laura's point about having a demographic for political party preference or for just people's preference in climate or interest in climate movements. And I was just wondering how that looked. I guess, I don't know if this is something Laura would know, or you guys, how asking that question determined who would be in the assembly. Because if people are saying, I have a strong I have a strong interest in this area, or for people who said, I don't have a strong interest or little knowledge, were they chosen then based on their strength of interest in climate change? And if so, like, does that leave out people who claim they don't have much interest or knowledge, but then that doesn't, like, maybe they do, but they don't have enough knowledge to say they have interest? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, and Laura, if you want to jump in and respond to that, that'd be great. I know for the UK, that was one of their demographic criteria, and something that they asked when they were doing recruitment was, you know, opinion about climate. And I'm not sure, kind of beyond them asking that, how that factored in to the conversations that they had. But yeah, it's a good point. Laura, do you want to add anything more to that?
Yeah, I definitely can. You know, I think it's specifically on attitudes about climate change, there is a pretty, my understanding, I think the question that the UK folks asked, and the one that I know that the Scotland recruitment folks asked, was about a level of concern. And whether they asked straight out, sort of using the 6, I don't know, this is again from the Yale folks, I'm dropping a link in the chat, the sort of 6 levels of concern of alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. I don't know whether they did some level of, a survey or some way to gauge and categorize individuals who fit the eligibility criteria by their level of concern about the issue specifically. And then what they would do, and the way to then select people would be to, as part of the criteria, say if 27% of the American population, or in this case, the Washington population, was alarmed about climate change, then ideally you would have a demographic criteria selection of these individuals, which would mean that 27% of those 80 members and 10 alternates would also be alarmed or the most seriously concerned. And then if, say, 10% were dismissive, similarly, you'd have the demographic representation of that attitude spectrum. So in terms of knowledge, though, being concerned about something doesn't mean necessarily that you know a lot about it, or vice versa. So I think it's more about just attitudes based on a survey specifically, which again then is more nuanced, of course, than asking political party preference versus policy or issue concern.
Saying all sorts of things and I was muted. Thank you so much, Laura, for weighing back in there. Yeah, and then we had a couple of other comments, and then I'm going to move us on to, because we are about to be into breakouts where we're going to dive even more deeply into these areas. So the comment from Brianna, curious to see what including subcategories for LGBTQ plus unhoused, undocumented people would do in terms of representing marginalized voices. So thank you for bringing that forward. And we had a couple folks that are in agreement with Laura and her explanation and kind of putting forward a suggestion about level of concern versus political party. Something from David, I agree with how Laura is describing the climate concern criteria. Fundamentally, we are striving to accurately reflect the state population. Something from Sue, in agreement as well. Ed, in agreement. And looks like we walked through, and thank you so much, Laura, for sharing the link. That's something that we've looked at as well, and we'll check in with Strategic Research Associates about how they might be able to incorporate that. Any final thoughts on this list here before we move into our small group breakout activity? We have something from Julianne, maybe just use political party preference as a double check that we don't end up too heavily weighted one side or another. I do think one benefit of citizen assemblies is people who don't normally get to talk to each other, getting to talk to each other, and party preference is one divide between people rather using it as recruitment criteria. Thank you, Julianne, for noting that. Okay, so we'll go ahead and skip forward to slide 25, please, Wendy. Great, so this is where we'll be spending the remainder of our time, and it'll be a combination of small group breakouts as well as bringing the full group back together for kind of full group discussion and recap kind of across the two groups. We are going to have two different groups here. Yeah, there'll be decisions around assembly member composition is a very critical part of the assembly process. So we're really just grateful to each of you for being here with us today, for spending 2 hours kind of diving more deeply into this and helping us chart a path forward on some of these elements. And given that the Washington Climate Assembly is committed to an equitable and inclusive process, and that the BIPOC community has been disproportionately impacted by climate change, kind of with those things in mind, as we advance into the small group breakouts, we are going to share with you both the draft target numbers that we have right now as they stand as a starting place for the Washington Climate Assembly recruitment effort. And then we will be reviewing and discussing recruitment goals and associated target numbers in the small groups. And if we can do a quick screen share of page number 8 in your meeting packet. And this is the page, if you remember the original meeting packet that I sent, got slightly revised. This is the revised version. That's why I resent this, because Strategic Research Associates did a couple updates to this page of our meeting packet. And so you'll see here, just for reference point, and again, we will be talking about this more in the small group setting. You'll see the minimum, you'll see the various different categories that we talked about. So gender, age, congressional district, voted, those ones that we just talked through. And then there are 2 columns. So there's a minimum number column and a maximum number column. And here we have that they'll be recruiting up to 125 people. That's actually 120 people, which will get us to the 80 assembly members plus 10. So they're over recruiting at this phase, recognizing that we have a sortition process in mid-December that will then generate, randomly via lottery, generate our 80 assembly members plus 10 alternates. So they're over recruiting for that purpose. And there are numbers associated with kind of the minimum and maximum as well, right? So just for example, the minimum column, 40 females, but they'll be recruiting up to 62 females, recognizing that we'll then end through the random kind of a sortition process, lottery process, we would then end up with the 40 females and 40 males. that goes, that's how they've broken down for each of the various categories that we've described. And I believe there is a question in here from, let's see, from Laura Berry, or comment, agree, especially for analyzing the results of the assembly, demonstrating that it's hopefully possible to overcome partisanship. So comment on a past comment. And then Julianne, a question about what about non-binary genders, intersex people? And I believe that's, we actually have that, but I agree, that isn't on their quota. So we need to check in with them about that. So great catch. And with that, again, we'll be referencing this document in our small group breakouts. And I want to get us queued up for that. If we can go ahead and switch back over to the next slide. So we have two groups, and Brent, who is our IT magician, is kind of working behind the scenes and has pre-assigned you to either group 1 or group 2. Group 1 will be facilitated by Mike Chang. Group 2 will be facilitated by Carla Brolier, and both Emily and myself will be joining one of those groups as well to support the facilitators. And the discussion questions that we'll be diving into in these small group settings. The first one, how do we address commitment to equity and inclusion in our target numbers? Second question, what are the main concerns, key considerations you'd like to be sure we consider when finalizing these target numbers for recruitment purposes? And then the third question that we'd like you all to discuss in the small group is related to how should we address these concerns? So kind of taking those concerns and then moving them into, okay, what is a suggested solution look like for that? And let's see here. All right, and so we are going to be using Mural, and this may be a new platform for some of you and not a new platform for others of you. And so when you get to your small group breakout, Emily for her group and myself for my group will be posting a link to the Mural boards in chat once we get into our breakout groups. And when you get that link, if you could just go ahead, click on the link and sign yourself in as a guest. You are able, on your screen, you're able to adjust your Zoom settings, so you can zoom in and zoom out on the bottom right once you get to the Mural platform. And then you can double click in a whiteboard. So basically Mural is the best platform, online platform that we found so far in this remote world that we're living in to simulate a whiteboard kind of brainstorm activity. So once you get there, you'll see little sticky notes. Grab a sticky note, you just double click on it and you can type away. And so both Mike and Carla will give you quick orientations once we get into our small group breakouts. And just a quick reminder too that to please keep your phone or headset muted. The groups will be about 10 people each. And let's begin. And then we've got a comment here, a question about should you assume using perspectives on climate change rather than political party or preference voting. So I'd say, there does seem to be general agreement around that as a good approach. So that seems like a good place to ground yourself in your conversation in small groups. Any questions about what we're doing or where you're headed in your small group breakouts before we ask Brent to put us in there? Okay, so with that, in just a second, you'll be invited into your breakout, and then both Mike for group 1 and Carla for group 2 will take it from there.
Perfect. And this is Brent. How much time would you like before we call you back?
I thought we were just going to leave it open, right, Brent? And
okay.
Then he was going to set it.
Perfect. Okay, there you go.
Yeah, we thank you all so much for the breakout groups. I'm excited. I know Mike is going to be do a report out from the breakout group that I participated in with him. And then conversely, Carla and Emily are going to be sharing out from their groups. So I'll turn it over to Mike.
Great. We definitely had a lot of great discussion. We were brought back to the main room in the middle of one, but I guess that's the nature of it. So we had a lot of great discussion, and I'd definitely be curious to hear other people's thoughts about this as well. So we were thinking a lot about race and ethnicity. So adding the Hispanic and non-Hispanic ethnic designation in addition to kind of the racial categories that are there as well. And as an acknowledgement that Hispanic is kind of embedded throughout a lot of different racial identities. Thinking about adding more weight to non-white racial categories to ensure that voices are heard or elevated, acknowledging how sometimes it can be intimidating for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to be in a room with a majority white group of folks, and that's a consideration as we think about structuring the assembly. We also had brief comments about initial selection by legal sex, but then a representative selection by self-reported gender from that. We had discussion about inclusion and acknowledgement of working parents and employment status as well. Kind of including people with different types of hobbies. So the one example that was provided was people who are bike riders. And then going down to the yellow is we did talk about the voting in 2020 election, whether that makes sense as a criteria in and of itself. And acknowledging that some people don't vote because they don't think it makes a difference, and kind of being kind of inclusive of those types of opinions. So moving down below, how we kind of operationalize working this mural board is kind of each row kind of stood for the concerns, the considerations to address from those concerns and how to address those concerns. So each row is kind of its own line. So we're saying a representative sample will obviously elicit kind of an assembly that is majority white, which, like we said earlier, might be intimidating for people of color, which could lead to higher turnover or non-participation from those assembly members. And so how to address some of these concerns, there's definitely talk about oversampling or overrepresentation of BIPOC folks or people from racial minorities. We also kind of talked about potentially taking out criteria of the voting history. There's also this concern also in relation to the first one is whether oversampling and not being representative, whether that might kind of hurt the credibility of this assembly process. And so how do we address concerns is we just want to ensure we're managing a process where all voices are heard. There was a talk about even in addition to the members that there are considerations about who's facilitating the assembly, who's presenting to the assembly, other types of people helping shape the agendas of these assemblies. There are other opportunities that if we don't oversample, that we can begin building in these other entrance points to ensure that there is adequate representation and consideration of these different types of perspectives. And then finally, kind of just keeping in mind when we do run an assembly process, whose voices historically are more likely to be heard and elevated, and thinking about how that perspective and how decisions are made, how deliberation happens. And we also begin thinking about this concern about some people are just more open-minded than others. And I guess the concern there is that people who come in with like really set in their ways and they're not open to change, that might not lead to any movement or any growth and progress within the assembly process. People were unsure how to address that specific concern from a question. We did talk about we can identify questions beforehand as we're going through and as criteria what we can ask potential assembly members. And we also talked about one of the other ways is just making sure that the people organizing the assembly cares. How can we create some of the communication beforehand to make sure that people are primed for the process as well. So I'll pause there and just check in with Gretchen real quick to see if I missed anything or any of my other breakout group participant and members.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I don't have anything more to add, but other participants may.
Yeah, great. Great. Well, thanks everyone. And I'll turn this over to Carla and Emily next.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So there was a lot of overlap, I believe, in a lot of the conversations that we had. And some of the conversations that we had around it, the time felt like it went really quick. So with that, some of the things that we might want to kind of just consider in this space is increasing some of the representation by people that are either historically impacted or that are a minority and a racial ethnic representation up to more of around 50%. So for example, consider having more around 50% indigenous peoples, or more working class people, or more women, or more people that might actually be impacted by some of the climate change decisions that are going to be in this space. And some of the reasoning for that is, in this current world that we live in, it is generally more patriarchal and more of a capitalist world. And some of the people in the room have the potential to have a larger influence on people that are generally historically marginalized in some of these spaces. So that is a topic that took up quite a bit of time, and it's still one that we are discussing on this in this area. And I'm going to pause right there and share it over to Emily so she can also help fill in some of the spaces here.
Yeah. So in addition to that, and there was an acknowledgement that there are many different ways to kind of overrepresent those minority perspectives, specifically around race and ethnic lines. One being that, like 50% or more could be represented by those identities. But there was also quite a bit about accessibility. One way to kind of create more space and ensure that folks who do have those kind of non-dominant or non-privileged perspectives are able to share their thoughts is to use different, facilitation styles, different practices, or kind of community working agreements around who speaks first, how the mic is passed, so to speak. And also making sure that there's a lot of accessibility, attention to accessibility in terms of communication styles, collaboration styles, making sure that it's accessible for people who have disabilities, and whose first language is not English, or English isn't spoken at home. And then a bit of, we didn't discuss this that much in conversation, but a bit, to a certain degree we did, around geographic representation of making sure there's rural urban representation adequately, considering how to include incarcerated perspectives of people who are incarcerated, and perspectives from people who are unhoused, undocumented, different education levels. And then some of the concerns that were brought up was, in addition to what kind of was already said, is really just having too small tribal representation, is potential illegitimacy, which I think speaks a bit to the other group and what they were talking about of, defensible, and the discomfort of some of minorities, quote unquote minorities, feeling, being able to share what they're thinking, maybe including youth in that perspective as well. And so, a couple considerations was using legal and political precedent as kind of justification or warrant for overrepresenting particular groups, and making sure that the pool is adequately large to sample from, or to select from, I guess. And again, kind of making sure there's good documentation, transparency in the process, that those are going to really help address any of the concerns around, is this why were certain methods chosen and whatnot. think that's everything that I was able to capture, or that was captured in the mural. So I don't know if anybody else wants to share anything.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. Is there anybody from the group that wants to address anything that we might have missed, or any other thoughts that might have come up in the interim?
I mentioned something, and it's not because I know that there's something available, but is there some other formula for determining representation that has not been used? It's relatively new, let's put it that way. That isn't based on political affiliation or voting, or just something that is defined by other terms. Maybe somebody else has used it in a different situation that would provide an example for us to use as a base for making these decisions.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. It sounds like from the comment that Laura, how about it?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question to me as somebody who, I wouldn't call myself a scholar because I'm not a student anymore and I'm not teaching at a university, but as a deliberative democracy, someone who's interested in it quite a lot. You know, the demographic criteria of who is represented is always been an evolving question, because in terms of how we measure who we are as a population, I think you can do it in so many different ways. You know, in the United States, we have these demographic criteria that if you filled out the census, for example, you know, you have these predetermined identity categories that can be used to sort of pick you out of a group and call you representative. And when it comes to citizens' assemblies and deliberative forums, you know, it depends on how many of those criteria you use, but what the folks from Cascadia and For the People have done have really pulled out pretty like the standard examples of what these criteria are. The only difference that I have seen, which is something that I find really interesting, I'm not really sure has as much relevance to this question because this is a statewide process, whereas this was a smaller example, is in Los Angeles, actually, around this idea of running community assemblies at the city level, specifically to inform city level climate policy. And what they were proposing to do, but it was put on hold because of COVID, was to use a tool called Cal EnviroScreen to actually understand and identify neighborhoods that were going to be most impacted by climate change, and then select individuals that were representative specifically just based on impact using this one specific tool. Now, so that is basically an example of a non-standard practice. And similarly, the overrepresentation would be a non-standard practice, but it's one of those things that is, you know, it's not to say that deliberative democracy is making it up as we go along, but in a lot of ways, these are experimental, you know, forays into a type of democracy that we in the United States are really unfamiliar with. So it really is kind of up to us to determine, given the state of Washington, given these challenges that we're facing, what is the best way to go forward with this? And so balancing legitimacy and what's been done before with, you know, need and historic representation, et cetera. I think it's really interesting for us to consider how to continue pushing the envelope for the best, you know, results for the people of Washington to make this really meaningful and to hopefully bring deliberative democracy to the US in a bigger way, while also, you know, relying on things that have worked in the past, but perhaps in different political contexts. And thank you to Leah for dropping that, the health disparities map. I think these kinds of tools can be really interesting to pick non-demographic criteria for selecting a representative sample for these kinds of processes.
Thank you so much for that, Laura. That is a really good point. And on that, it is a great point to also remember that this is the first Citizens Climate Assembly in the US. So we are trying to take best practices from other places, but this is new for the US, and the way that we do monitor these demographics and like put all of these together. This is there might be mistakes in this, but we're all learning as we're going with this. And we really appreciate all of the thought and the effort and all of the time that we're putting into creating this. And to the note up here also from Julianne and Monica, we're going to make sure that we do note down also folks with criminal records are those that are currently in prison as well, just to make sure that we have it all captured adequately in here. And it looks like Ed, did you want to add something as well?
Yeah, I really appreciate this discussion, and of course all these things are sort of figuring out how to meld it all together. I do want to throw in one more thing that I forgot to mention during our small group, and that's the fact that if you look at the entire population of Washington State, the population of young people 19 or under is much higher than the percent of people from 16 to 19. And I don't know exactly how to do this, but you could make the equity argument that perhaps the 16 to 19 group should actually be sized to match the group that are 19 or younger. Certainly from an equity perspective, that's who's going to inherit this world that we're creating. So another idea to just kind of talk about. I don't know what other people think about that.
I really like that idea of increasing representation of the younger folks. And also, what about the idea of using the demographics of the youngest Washington State citizens, like, or not citizens, but people living here? Like, what if we use the demographics of 0 to 19 as like, that's the percentage of people of color we want. That's the percentage of like people of certain, like living in households of certain incomes, like, et cetera. Because I think then you would, one, have a rationale for why you, for why you're doing the percentages, but also there are more youth who are people of color. There are more youth who are lower income compared to the rest of Washington, but you could really argue that's who's going to inherit the issues we're facing.
Yeah, that is, thank you so much for offering that, Julianne. I think that is definitely not a method that our group had thought of. So really, really appreciative of you offering that.
Did we discuss how young we wanted to go for the kiddos? Because maybe just bringing in a kiddo that is really young to show them that this is for the kiddo's future. It is something that, like, my son's 6 years old and he's scared. He's scared the planet's heating up, and I don't know if presenting that to them maybe would open a heart or two, but I'm not sure if that's too young. So yeah.
Great, thanks, Monica. Yeah, and I think definitely from the conversations earlier, kind of this minimum age range is definitely something, kind of what Carla said earlier. These are by no means our draft eligibility and demographic criteria. So thanks for offering that. So I recognize we have, oh, and thanks to Laura for saying about including youth as expert presenters. That's also true. So Wendy, if you can go to the PowerPoint, we just want to thank everyone for joining today. This has been really fruitful and productive conversations. It's really great to kind of get all of this insight, this feedback, and your expertise in this. In terms of next steps, we wanted to just highlight that we will synthesize what we hear today, and we're going to take it back to the research firm that's conducting a lot of this recruitment, Strategic Research Associates. Knowing that we do have a lot of ideas and 2 hours is by no means enough to talk through everything, we might circle back with a few of you with follow-up questions in the next week or so. So please don't be alarmed if you get a follow-up email asking us for clarification. I think there's just a lot of good ideas, and we just want to make sure we are doing our due diligence to make sure we follow through each option we have. And then we wanted to say how to continue staying involved. So right now we still have other roles that we need to fill. And you can continue. I know a lot of people have heard about this through our application page, but I'm just going to resend it because I know there are a lot of kind of simultaneous recruitment opportunities for different assembly roles happening at this moment. I also recognize sometimes that you might not have been interested in a role before, but now you've attended one of these workshops and you're like, oh, I want to see where this goes, or your mind has changed in something. So just want to put in a plug that there are still other things, especially the initiating team is still recruiting for a monitoring team and trying to get kind of a diverse set of folks as part of that team. We also wanted to put in our email address, which is info@waclimateassembly.org. For any additional questions, follow-ups to this workshop as well. And you can use that to communicate with our team. So with that, and then also a reminder, I did put in the application page, but if you just go to waclimateassembly.org, you can find more information about all of the aspects of this assembly process and of the design process, including the recruitment process when that gets finalized. And there's the slide. So thank you, thank you again, everyone, for attending today's meeting. It was really fruitful. It was really productive. I can definitely say that I'm personally really grateful for everyone's participation and attendance in gathering a lot of this feedback today. It's really going to help refine and make sure that we lead a really inclusive process for our member recruitment. So thank you, everyone. Any other last words from other coordinating team members? Well, thank you all, and I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon, and we'll hopefully be in communication soon about some of the results from this as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks all.